This was an absolutely wild amount of money just to click submit. In this video, I'm going to break down every single cost of applying to med school in the US and walk through exactly what I spent through the process. Then at the end, I'll give you 5 tips to spending less money when you apply. So the first category of major expenses is the MCAT. Now, you do have to pay to take the exam, but that's actually not where most people are breaking the bank. Some students spend thousands of dollars on prep programs and private tutoring to achieve their desired results. This may seem insane, but a low MCAT score is often what stands between applicants and their dream of becoming a doctor, so they're willing to spend a lot if it can get them there. There are ways to get scholarships and use fee assistance programs for reduced MCAT prep pricing, which I'll cover later on in the video. The truth is though, not everyone needs an expensive prep course, and plenty of students do well on their own. There are differing opinions on how beneficial prep courses can actually be, and everybody needs something a little bit different, so there's substantial differences in what people actually end up spending on the MCAT. Personally, I spent a total of $4,599, which if I bought that same course today, it would cost $6,999. This is a massive amount of money to be spending, but I saved up a lot for it and I thought it would turn out to be a good investment. And it did. I ended up being offered a lot more in scholarships than I originally spent on the scholarship. So along with just getting to go to medical school, this made paying for the prep program feel a lot less like a sacrifice. Actually signing up to take the MCAT costs between $300 and $400 depending on when you sign up to take the test. So I signed up as early as I could and it was $320 for me. But then after I finished the test, I wasn't sure how I did, so I immediately booked another test date that was about a month away. And I didn't end up taking this second test because I liked the score of my first test, but that still cost me another $320 to sign up. The last thing I spent money on for the MCAT was an erasable booklet and pen. That's like exactly what they give you on test day. I wanted to have a really realistic experience studying for the test, and so I got this so I could write down all of my notes and all my answers while I was taking practice tests on the actual booklet, or a booklet that's very similar to the one that they were going to give me in the actual test. So this ended up costing me $21.29, which brings my total to $5,260. Looking back, I probably didn't need to spend so much on a prep course or on a backup test that I didn't actually end up using, but it's hard to say I would do things differently because things did end up turning out so well. The second category of expenses is the primary application, which can be divided into the 3 main services that students typically apply to: TMDSAS for Texas medical schools, AMCAS for non-Texas MD schools, and ACOMIS for non-Texas DO schools. The purpose of these organizations is to independently standardize the application process for the schools they service, so the fees associated with each of them are different because they service different schools and have different requirements. TMDSAS takes a really straightforward approach. They charge a flat fee of $200 to apply to any number of the schools in Texas, so you just pay the $200 and then you check all the boxes of all the schools you want to apply to. Really simple. AMCAS, on the other hand, they charge you for each MD school you apply to. So for the first one, it costs $170, and then after that, it costs $43 each additional school you want to apply to. ACOMIS is similar. They charge $198 for the first DO school and then $50 for each school after that. So I applied to 6 schools in Texas and 27 other MD schools. So I paid $200 to TMDSAS and $1,288 to MCAS. I originally considered applying to 6 DO schools through ACOMIS, which would have come out to $448, but I decided against it in the end. So my total primary application came out to $1,488. And this was an absolutely wild amount of money just to click submit on the application. This becomes a barrier for a lot of people that want to apply to med school, but have to reduce the number of schools they're applying to because it's just so expensive. The more of those boxes you check of the schools you want to apply to, the more expensive it's going to be. So when you do these primary applications, there are 2 more costs that feel sort of like hidden costs. First is sending official transcripts to the application services and to medical schools, and the second is using letter of recommendation services. Official transcript transfers typically come in at $3 to $15 depending on what school you're sending them from and what they charge for shipping. I had to send 2 transcripts to 2 different application services, and this came out to a total of $22. Another good thing to note is that if you take any classes between the time you apply to med school and when you actually go to med school, you have to send a second copy of your official transcripts after you finish, and it has to be obviously a fresh copy that you then have to pay for again. So for letters of recommendation, which you're also sending uploading to the application services when you do your primary application. Your letter writers can upload directly to the application services, but this can be sort of a hassle, especially if you're applying to schools in Texas, MD schools, DO schools. You're gonna have to have them upload the letter 3 different times. So some people like to use a letter manager like Interfolio, to which you can submit all of the letters, or your letter writers rather can submit all of their letters to Interfolio. Interfolio then compiles them, and then you can communicate with AMCAS to let them know you want your Interfolio file to be distributed to the application services. So if you opt for this option, it costs $48 a year, but some universities actually do this on their own. Like my university offered this as a free service. So definitely look into the options at your school to see if they offer something similar. But if not, you may be best off using something like Interfolio because it makes the process so simple. Next up are the school-specific secondary applications, which you submit to schools a couple months after you submit your primary application. And this is typically a fee around $100. The most I paid for any school was $130 for schools like Georgetown and Tufts. And the least I paid was $85 for schools like University of Arizona. So it can kind of range between those values. So I received 31 secondaries, but along the way, I realized 9 of those schools I didn't actually really want to go to. So I ended up only doing 22 of them. So in total, for the 22 applications, this cost $2,345. I'm not sure why they charge so much for this application. I mean, it's pretty frustrating to have already paid all this money to apply to all these schools, and then you have to pay more money to apply to the schools specifically. And it seems that they use it just to filter out the number of people who can apply, which is really frustrating because you're at a disadvantage inherently. If you apply to less schools, you're statistically less likely to get in, and this is being determined by how much money you have available to put towards these applications. Fifth on the list is CASPer, which is a test of ethical and situational decision making. Now, most med schools don't require applicants to take the CASPer test, but those that do include it as a pretty big part of the admissions process. Thankfully, it's much less expensive than the MCAT, and assuming you already have a webcam, an internet connection, and decent typing speed, you only have to pay $12 to take the test, and then $12 for each of the schools you want to send your scores to. I ended up sending my CASPer results to 9 schools, so this came out to a total of $120. It's good to keep in mind that unlike MCAT scores, which are valid for several years after you take the test, CASPer scores are only good for one application cycle, so reapplicants have to pay to take the test again. Next up is interview travel and virtual interview equipment. So traveling for interviews can end up being the largest expense by far of the entire application cycle, and medical schools obviously don't coordinate with each other on the timing of interview invites. So each interview is typically a separate trip. It's really difficult to go to 2 different schools that are in the same location at the same time, unless you already have gotten offers from both of them and you can coordinate. Otherwise, you have to take an individual trip for each of the interviews. Thankfully for me, only one of my interviews was in person, but it was still kind of expensive. After paying for flights, a hotel, a rental car, and food, this came out to a total of $497. In the past, people have paid a lot more than this to go to multiple interview locations. I'm really grateful that I only had to go to one place to interview, but the majority of interviews for this past year, and it seems like going forward, are going to be virtual, which makes things a lot cheaper. But this being the case, you have to think a little bit about virtual interview equipment, which may include a webcam, headphones with a microphone, and a light source. These are things that some people have before applying to med school, but if you don't, I recommend spending at least a small amount to make sure you present your best self on interview day. Number 7 on the list of expenses is the fees associated with being accepted to medical school. If a medical school does charge fees when they accept you, it's typically in 2 forms: a background check fee and a deposit that allows you to hold your spot in the class until you make your decision later on in the cycle. So background checks are sometimes paid for by the medical school, but sometimes they're paid by the applicant, in which case it can cost anywhere from $30 to $100 depending on the service that they're using. I paid background check fees for 2 schools, and this came out to a total of $102 for about $50 a piece. As for the deposits that hold your spot in the medical school, only 3 of 5 schools I've been accepted to have actually required one, and all of those have been $100, which brings us up to a total cost of $402 in acceptance fees. This can be much larger, especially with osteopathic schools, DO schools, that can require deposits of several $1,000s that you pay throughout the application cycle. This is meant to determine the level of commitment of future students, which is understandable, but it is important to think about this as you're choosing which schools to apply to. The 8th and final expense of applying to medical school is second look days or campus visits after you've been accepted and they invite you back to see the facilities, meet with students, and learn more about their school, their curriculum, and see if that's where you'd actually want to go. So for schools that aren't local to you, this involves the same travel costs as interview day. I only had one second look day in person that I had to travel for, and in total it costs nearly $700. So if we add all these categories together, we get a grand total of $10,833. This is insane. I've actually never calculated all this out, and it's mind-boggling to me to think that I spent this much money on the application cycle. Now, not everybody can or should spend that much money on an application, so I want to give you a few tips on how to reduce the burden of application fees and save more money throughout the process. Tip number 1 is to apply for the AAMC Fee Assistance Program. And if you qualify, this can significantly reduce what you pay to sign up for the MCAT and submit a primary application through MCAS. Some schools will also waive your secondary application fee if you qualify for this program, so it can end up saving you hundreds to thousands of dollars. COMIS does a similar application fee waiver for the initial fee, but TMD-SAS doesn't provide any sort of aid. Tip number 2 is to consider self-studying for the MCAT. If you're able to score well without a prep program and you don't want to spend the money, then you should probably just self-study. But even if you do need a prep program, there's massive variability in prices, so think carefully about what you actually need to do well. I'd recommend checking out the reviews by Test Prep Insight and Test Guide, which are linked in the description below. They've done pretty thorough reviews on a lot of the top MCAT prep programs, and it's really helpful to see how much variability there is in pricing and services. So take a look at those and see what you actually need for the test. Tip number 3 is to only apply to schools you would actually go to. So find out as much as you can about each school you're considering and develop your personal criteria about the cost, location, curriculum, opportunities you'll have, and any other factors that are going to be important to you. You don't have to set very strict parameters, just enough that you get a reasonable number of schools on your list. The shorter this list is, the less overall fees you'll need to pay. The Medical School Admissions Requirements, or MSAR, website can be helpful in making these decisions, but this requires a $28 subscription, and a lot of information can be found from individual school websites. Tip number 4 is to choose virtual interviews. Some schools are giving applicants the choice of virtual interviews over in-person interviews, and if you're equally comfortable with both virtual and in-person interviews and you don't care to be on the campus, it could save you several $100s to stay home on your computer. Tip number 5 is to minimize costs when travel to interviews is necessary. If you don't have any friends or relatives to stay with in the area where you're interviewing, just find out if medical students or residents typically house the interviewing applicants. This is the case at several schools and can be really helpful in reducing costs. It can also be beneficial to get a lot of airline credit card points in the months leading up to interviews, which can help to pay for some or all of your travel. So that's it for saving money during the application cycle. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos like this one.